Our last video clip dealt with intrusive igneous landforms, or plutonic landforms, like batholiths, laccoliths, dikes, and sills. This video clip is going to deal with folds. Last week we learned that composite cone volcanoes generally form along OC convergent and OO convergent plate boundaries. You should be able to give a couple real-world examples of each of these. For example, be sure that you can name the two plates involved in the volcanic arc that is formed for a specific OC convergent plate boundary and at least one specific OO convergent plate boundary. Also, for review, why don't volcanoes form at CC convergent plate boundaries? If you can't answer these questions, or you're not even sure what I mean by these questions, you should definitely go back and look at the video clip on plate boundaries. Understanding plate boundaries is fundamental to being successful in this unit. So, moving on. Composite cone volcanoes are not the only thing that forms at convergent plate boundaries. We learned last week that at convergent plate boundaries where subduction takes place, OC and OO convergent plate boundaries, we can also see the accretion of terranes. For this week, though, we're going to look at the other two processes that are occurring at convergent plate boundaries, folding and faulting. The compressional stress that's present at convergent plate boundaries forms folds and faults. We're going to be studying three specific types of folds. There are actually more than three types, but we're only going to address three in our study. As you can imagine, in order for folding to take place, there has to be a lot of compressional stress, and also, likely, the material has to be buried fairly deep in the earth, where there's high temperatures and pressures that allow the rocks to be able to bend rather than break when the stress is applied. So folding is the bending of crustal rocks by compression and or uplift. It can occur at any scale, but generally this is all happening deep in the earth where there's high temperatures and high pressures. As stated here, most folding occurs due to compressional stress. You can see these flat-lying sedimentary layers become folded when compressional stress is applied. This diagram also shows the three types of folds that we're going to address: monoclines, synclines, and anticlines. Pause the video for a moment and see if you can figure out what each of these folds is really about. Distinguishing among these three types of folds is actually fairly easy. Let's look at this picture in a little more detail. In your notes, I encourage you to list the three types of folds, monoclines, synclines, and anticlines, and give a little description and perhaps a diagram of each. First, monoclines. As the name suggests, monoclines only have one limb to them. The layered material here is going flat, and then it dips down. It doesn't dip back up. Or if you're coming from the other direction, you could think of the flat layers simply dipping up and not dipping back down. Monoclines can form through compressional stress, as shown here, but sometimes monoclines also form when there's a buried fault below the monocline that's pushing up one side of the monocline. Anticlines are the upturned folds, or arched folds, if you want an easy way to remember it. Arch starts with the letter A, and anticline starts with the letter A. Also, quite frankly, I remembered it because if you draw an arch like that, it kind of looks like the capital letter A. Synclines, in contrast, are the downturned folds. So synclines and anticlines tend to go together. Anticline, syncline, etc. Practice identifying each of these three types of folds, and notice that they can all form due to compressional stress. It's tempting to think that anticlines will always produce ridges and synclines will always produce valleys, but this is not the case. You definitely can have anticline ridges and synclinal valleys, but you can also have anticline valleys and synclinal ridges. Let's check this out. If the uppermost layers of rock are fairly susceptible to erosion, you may have erosion of that material and forming an anticlinal valley. Similarly, if you encounter a very resistant rock, that may not erode away, whereas the rocks around it will, and you can end up with a synclinal ridge. Take a moment to pause the video and check out each of these 4 different possibilities. Also, interestingly, geologists rarely have the side view to look at when trying to figure out if anticlines or synclines are present. Instead, geologists can only walk over the surface of the Earth. And one way we figure out if we are at an anticline or a syncline has to do with the age of the rocks. If the oldest rocks are in the center of a pattern, we know we're in an anticline. If the youngest rocks are in the center of a pattern, we know we're in a syncline. So why do we care about anticlines and synclines? Well, one reason we care about folding is that anticlines are very important to the oil and natural gas industry. Indeed, we'll see that anticlines are where we look for oil and natural gas. As you hopefully recall, several sedimentary rocks, including limestone and shale, form in the ocean. And sandstone, another important sedimentary rock, forms in beach environments. When the microscopic marine organisms that live throughout the water column in the ocean die, they simply sink to the bottom and they get buried in the muck. Since there's little oxygen in ocean sediments, decomposition does not occur as rapidly as it does on land. Instead, the carbon in these organisms is converted to oil and natural gas, 2 of the 3 fossil fuels. And eventually, over millions of years, these oils and natural gas work their way up through the rocks. They move up simply because gases and liquids are less dense than the surrounding rocks. Limestones and sandstones are quite permeable, and the natural gases and oils pass right through them as the fluids move upward. Shale, on the other hand, is made of compacted mud, and it is not permeable, so the fluids cannot be easily transmitted up through the shale. So oil and natural gas basically get stuck beneath the shale layer. If the layers were flat, there would be diffuse oil and natural gas all throughout the region underneath the shale. But when there's anticlines and synclines, as the oil and gas migrate up, they encounter the shale and keep moving upward until they're directly under an anticline. So if you're a petroleum geologist, you're very interested in finding anticlines. Anticlines in particular that consist of sedimentary rock that is in the ocean or that was in the ocean. You want to find anticlines that are topped with shale as a cap rock that's very impermeable, and then you're going to drill oil and natural gas wells into the top of that anticline to obtain the oil and natural gas that are trapped beneath that shale layer. Oil and natural gas build up under shale capped layers in anticlines. Here in California, we have lots and lots of sedimentary rocks offshore, including layers that probably have significant oil and natural gas deposits. Additionally, even though where we are located today is currently a transform plate boundary, 60 to 250 million years ago or so, there used to be a convergent plate boundary along this same continental margin, so there was compressional stress. So, offshore and onshore, actually, there are anticlines and synclines present. And petroleum geologists look for these anticlines to drill into to obtain oil and natural gas. Your textbook has a short animation on folding. I encourage you to view it either in your ebook or in Mastering Geography. Lastly, pause the video here and make sure that you can answer the questions posed on this slide. As usual, I encourage you to write the answers to these questions down in your notes so that you have this information for our next exam.